So, on tonight's philosophical concept, we're going to be continuing in my little mini series on philosophical concepts that I think I'm coining, and I have coined. This is the last of the series, and we're going to go over the witch's test. But before we do, just wanted to let you know that I don't know if I'm actually the one that's coined these tests. So, let me know in the comment section if there's already some term to describe these concepts. This one is the most recent one in terms of ones I've thought up. It's probably something I had in my head in high school, but completely forgot about, and that I've only come to conceptualize as its own test and coin as with this name in the last about 2 or 3 years or so. And again, before we get started here too, just wanted to let everyone know that that I'm just going to basically be reading this off of the note on Facebook that I created for this, because Facebook is going to be phasing out its notes section. So this is me basically archiving these concepts. So let me know in the comment section if you think there's a better way to go about archiving these concepts. So I'm going to actually read it just basically off the screen, and as I go, if I think there's something I need to interject, I'll interject it to make it a little more obvious as to what it is I'm trying to explain. So without further ado, let's finish up this little mini-series, if you will, with the witch's test. The common example is one we all know, so I'll just dive right into the definition. And this is the definition of the witch's test: a logical test in which the end outcome of the test is determined by the mere application of the test and not how the subject performs within it, as the end result of the test is the same no matter how the subject performs. The goal of the test is irrelevant to whether or not the test qualifies as a witch's test, because the unintended consequences may extend beyond the scope of the perceived intended consequences. So it doesn't matter if this is if the goal is to achieve a witch's test. We determine if something is a witch's test based on what goes into it. This is slightly different from a Kafka trap, because denial or acceptance of guilt of a thing is not necessarily part of the test. So remember, the Kafka trap was, if you say that you are not guilty of the thing, it means that you are guilty of the thing. Evidence, you saying you're not guilty of the thing is evidence to support the fact that you are guilty of the thing. And the outcome does require the actual application of the test. So in the case of the Kafka trap, you really don't have to actually apply the test. You just have to say, are you guilty of the thing? And if you say no, then you're guilty of the thing. If you say yes, you're guilty of the thing. The iconic example of the witch's test is one we all know. A woman is accused of being a witch. A test is performed to determine if she is a witch. Her hands are tied and her legs and feet bound, and then she is hurled into a lake or a pond. If she sinks, she's not a witch. If she floats, she's a witch. But the actual meaningful consequence is the same. If she's not a witch, she drowns. If she is a witch, she's burned at the stake. So in this case, if she floats, then what happens is she's a witch, so we burn her at this, so we kill her. If she sinks, then she's not a witch, but she dies. So the outcome is identical. In both cases, she dies. So again, the immediate effect of the test itself doesn't have to have the exact and identical outcome, and the necessary outcome of the test within the test isn't important to whether or not the actual outcome of the test is the same. So if you're testing for how well somebody can shoot a jump shot, and the result of the test is that at the end of the test, they're exhausted, and if no matter how they perform, they're going to be exhausted. If the thing that matters is whether or not they're exhausted, then we're starting to look at whether or not this is a witch's test. Ergo, regardless of her performance, the woman is still killed, which is basically the goal of the test. The specific semantic differences, death by drowning versus death by burning, martyrdom versus justifiability of killing, the premise of which is being a real thing, the premise that the test actually proves the claim, in the classic example, aren't really important to illustrate the main point. If she is subject to the test at all, she's going to die at the mob's hands. So, I mean, there's a certain degree to which you can disregard my basic explanation. We all know what a witch's test is. We try a witch to see if she's a witch, and if she's a witch, then we kill her. If she's not a witch, then because of the application of the test, she's going to die anyways. So we've basically predetermined that she might as well be a witch. There's no difference between her being a witch and her not being a witch. It doesn't matter how she performs within the test. The outcome of the test is effectively still the same. In logic, if the only approvable test of a statement is one in which all outcomes in the end cannot possibly vary, again, regardless of the subject's performance in the test, then the test itself removes disprovability from the statement. Very often this is done through the use of an impossible standard, which we've talked about, or more specifically, the bending of addition of words to make any interpretation of the thing necessarily require that the thing exists, regardless of condition or circumstance. When we've talked about this in previous videos, I believe we talked about it in the Dragon in My Garage, and yeah, I think this is something we expanded upon in the Dragon in My Garage. To clarify, I'll use a modern day example of that we've all seen. 1, person gets called a racist. I'm going to get spicy here. 2, to test if the person is a racist, they must either subscribe to a policy, practice, or idea which they find overtly racist or reject it. If they subscribe to the above, they have absolved themselves of guilt in the eyes of the claimant, but in reality have admitted what they know to be racism, and reasonable witnesses will still call our subject a racist. 4, if they do not subscribe to the above, they're still racists. Bending the definition of racism to mean something that it has never meant, and to, instead, supplant the definition with one that precludes a thing from ever not being racist, is another one of these examples. If we change what the definition of systemic racism once meant, a particular system which is demonstrably racist, with a racist being one who believes in the a prioristic superiority of one race over another, to the ethereal notion of a quote unquote power plus prejudice, then there is no test which could possibly result in a thing not exhibiting racism, except those that exhibit the overt racism exemplified by the previously accepted definition. To clarify, here is a classic witches test we've all seen. So in this case, when you completely redefine a thing to a point where no matter what definition test you apply to a circumstance or to a thing, it will always be met. Then you don't have a definition. Then you have a witches test. What's the difference between testing something? So if we redefine the word racist to mean something where there's no possible test to apply to a subject, like let's say I claim that Jim Smith is a racist, and the test we apply is the definition of the word racist. Well, how do you define racist? If that definition is one that there's no way Jim, knowing nothing about Jim, there's no way Jim could not fit that definition, then we've created a witches test. Well, is he a racist? Does he believe in race? Does he believe in the a prioristic hierarchy of the races? No. Okay, well then let's redefine racism to mean something that is impossible to avoid. Does he live in a society in which if you are of a certain race, which is an immutable characteristic, where if you're of that race, you must be a racist, or where racism is an a prioristic nature of the system, and he obviously lives within the system. If the test you apply is to redefine a word to mean everything, then you've created a witches test. In this case, Jim is going to be burnt at the stake. In which case, Jim is going to be labeled a racist no matter what. And then, he's going to have his livelihood ruined. To clarify, here's a classic witches test we've all seen. How do we know if someone is acting in a racist manner? Test. Racism equals prejudice plus power. If a white man shoots a black man, then racism equals prejudice plus power, so the shooting was unjustified because it was racist. And if you agree with the definition, then we have witnessed an example of racism, so riots are justified. If you disagree with the definition, then you have just exemplified the definition in practice, because you have prejudiced your assessment of the shooting, which is an example of racism, so riots are justified. In both cases, riots are going to manifest. Now, someone might not see you as a racist. You might not fit certain definitions of racist, but in both cases, if that's the definition we're going to apply, then there is always going to be a definition for riots. In both cases, the definition has been bent so that no matter how you interpret the situation, an instance of racism must occur and riots are thus justified. So remember, the test has to actually be applied, but the outcome of the test is going to be the same no matter what. To simplify, either the shooting was an example of racism, so riots, or you are a racist, so riots. So do you see how in that circumstance, the application of the test doesn't in its immediate face result in the same thing, but the true purpose of the test is to determine if there are going to be riots. And in this case, there are always going to be riots. The mere application of the test is what determines the outcome, riots, because the end result is the same no matter how the subject performs in the test. This could also be applied when an external fallacy is presented, such as a false equivalency. If the statement, if you believe X person was acting in self-defense, but believe Y person wasn't, you're a racist, is a clear example of a false equivalency, then you're either a bad person because you subscribed to a clear false equivalency, or you're a bad person because you agree with the conditions of the statement. So, a reasonable person, of course in this case, would believe that this is a false equivalency, but they'll be seen as a bad person. Or you agree with the statement, in which case you're agreeing with the false equivalency, which kind of in some way will make you look like a bad person. If the witch's test comes as the result of a moving standard, which we've talked about with how you can form definitions, its existence is an extension of the impossible standard type 1, which we've talked about. If the witch's test comes as the result of an internally logical contradiction, so for example, if you believe X and also don't believe Y, then A, when X and Y are mutually exclusive conditions, or a paradox, then it's an example of an impossible standard type 3. Again, we've talked about that. If the witch's test depends on an admission or rejection of guilt, it is an example of a Kafka trap. So you could call a Kafka trap in this example a more specific type of a witch's test, I suppose. So that's actually going to, I think, conclude this miniseries. Let me see if there's more to this. Nope. That is actually going to conclude this miniseries. I hope you guys have kind of enjoyed. We'll continue with more commonly understood and commonly known and long and much olderly coined, I suppose is how I'll phrase this, philosophical concepts in our next videos in this series, which I don't know when that's going to be. So I guess you guys will have to subscribe so you can keep up with the notifications. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.